Good evening. My name is Amanda Sharon, and I am a Kevin Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would just like to remind you to please turn off any cell phones or other devices that make noise. Following Mr. Robbins' remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Introducing tonight's speaker is Rochelle Beaudoin, a professor in the Fine Arts Department here at St. Anselm College. Professor Beaudoin received her bachelor's degree studying studio art at the College of the Holy Cross and her master's in digital media from Rhode Island School of Design. She was presented with an award of excellence in fine arts from Rhode Island School of Design. In her artwork, she uses video, photography, and performance to explore feminine iconography and popular culture. Here at St. Anselm, Professor Beaudoin teaches digital art and imaging and visual communication, where students learn to work with both traditional and digital media. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rochelle Beaudoin.
Thank you. I'm so excited to see so many people here tonight for an art event. It's very exciting for our college to welcome Christopher Robbins. Christopher Robbins works on the uneasy cusp of public art and community action, creating sculptural interventions in the daily lives of strangers. He uses heavy material demands and carefully twisted work process to craft awkwardly intimate social collaborations. He's built his own hut out of mud and sticks and lived in it while serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Benin, West Africa. He spoke at a United Nations conference about his cross-cultural digital arts and education work in the South Pacific, and has lived and worked in London, Tokyo, West Africa, the Fiji Islands, and the former Yugoslavia. He is exhibited at the Venice Biennial of Architecture, ZKM, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the New Museum Festival of Ideas, Trade School at the Whitney Museum, the National Museum of Wales, and has been awarded residencies and fellowships from Skowhegan, McDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire, Haystack, Penland, and Anderson Ranch, among others. He has an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and is now on the sculpture faculty at SUNY Purchase College in New York. One of the projects he'll talk about tonight, Ghana Think Tank, was co-founded in 2006 by Chris and other classmates of ours at RISD and was recently awarded a Creative Capital grant, which is very big news. So Chris and I met in graduate school in 2007 and when we graduated from RISD, and we have become friends and stayed friends since then. He's really one of the best types of friends, one of those types of peers who will support you in your artistic and academic endeavors and cheer you on, but he'll also call you out when you're not really on track or if he questions some of your ideas, and those are really some of the best types of friends to have. Chris has a great energy, as I'm sure you'll see, and his energy is very inspiring. I often hope to keep up with him. I guess I'll say that. I strive to keep up with him as well. I'm sure that you'll find his presentation really engaging, and that hopefully, and I think it will sort of change the way you think about art and social interaction. So, without further ado, again, here is Christopher Robbins.
Thanks, Rochelle, and thanks, Anne, for all your work putting this together, and NHIOP and St. Anselm, and everyone. I'm glad to be here. It's really good to see everyone who's here, and I guess I'll get started. So, if all goes well, we're here. Okay, how's my audio? Am I okay here? And if I step away, am I still audible back there, or not so much? Okay. Well, if you can't hear me, I guess raise your hand so I come closer to the mic, because I do have energy and I tend to move around a bunch, so I want to make sure people can still hear me. So I'm here today to talk mostly about Ghana Think Tank, which is a organization or project that I founded in 2006, along with John Ewing and Mateo Donkor, and the premise was developing the first world. Carmen Montoya, who also went to RISD with us, joined in 2009 and has been working with us ever since. And this project, we all came at it from slightly different perspectives. We all have different things that we want to do with it, but the basic premise is that we had all worked overseas and been in this really uncomfortable position of being an outsider who supposedly knew what was best for a culture we hadn't grown up in. And Mate had grown up in Ghana and actually experienced international development from both sides, of being someone in the village receiving it and then working for nonprofits, for non-governmental organizations from the others. And it was out of that that Ghana Think Tank started in 2006, where we decided to flip this and kind of try for us as Americans to feel what it's like for someone with their best intentions, but from another culture, really imposing their goodwill on you. And that's where it started. It's become a bunch of different things in the 6 years, 7 years now, I guess, since it began. Now, like I said, Ghana Think Tank started for all of us for different reasons. For me, when I look back, it started here. About 10 years before Ghana Think Tank actually began, when I was Peace Corps worker in Benin, West Africa, and signed up for an African wrestling tournament, thought it'd be a great way to meet people, and immediately realized that there were no weight classes in West African wrestling. And proceeded to get my butt publicly kicked over and over again by the biggest, baddest guy from every village in the area where I would then be working for the next 2 years. And why I think this is kind of where Ghana Think Tank started is because it pounded into me physically the lesson that if you operate based on the assumptions of how things work in your own culture, it's not going to work out for you when you're working in a different culture. And this was my somewhat brutal but very effective way of being taught that my first, second, third month in the country. And this idea of wrong assumptions quickly became a theme that when I was working overseas that I would encounter. Here's a project, I guess 3 months out of college in Benin that I was working on that I was so embarrassed about that when I wrote home about it, it sounded so horrible to my American ears. But it actually worked out. It was making tofu. And I just thought, I grew up in New York City. There's this Upper West Side guy out of college, thinks he's going to go to rural Africa and teach people to make tofu. It just sounded like some crazy hippie yuppie fantasy. And I couldn't believe that I was in the Peace Corps working for the government doing this crazy sounding thing. And so everything in my gut was telling me, this is stupid. You're a silly person. But the fact was, it actually had a really useful place. In the region of Benin in West Africa where I was living and working, protein was a big issue for younger children and babies. There were plenty of animals around that were killed and people ate, but it never got down to the youngest. There was a very patriarchal system, and guests and the father would get it, and then it would go to the mamas, and then it would go, and there was pretty much no meat left by the time it was the little children's chance. Another protein source we could have depended on was eggs, but there was a saying in the areas where I worked that if you fed eggs to children, they'd grow up to be thieves. So the two major protein sources were off the table. But there was soy everywhere. A lot of companies were coming in and they were growing soy as a cash crop, asking villagers to. And it wasn't anything anybody ate, but it was something a company would come in, give them the seeds, tell them we guarantee to buy all the grain you make at the end of the year, and we'll pay you at the harvest for it. So there was this potential protein source that had no negative stigmas attached to it and that wasn't being eaten. And as I was working there, I started to realize there was a tradition of making cheese, fermenting cow's milk, curdling cow's milk, and using these kind of handmade sieves to turn it into cheese. And I realized, well, we could use the soy, make it into soy milk, and do a really similar process to make a soy cheese. And the great thing was the way they ate that cheese was partnered with a legume, with peanuts or other legumes, so that it completed that protein. And so this was this idea that felt silly to me when I explained it to my Upper West Side friends in Manhattan, but really actually had a great validity there. And it was another lesson of you have to question your assumptions when you're working overseas. And it was sort of a gentle introduction to some of the harsher gaps from outsider solutions. This thing that would typically happen in a lot of villages was they'd have an open well and a And some charity organization would come in and say, this well is actually dangerous. If a goat should fall down there and die, it would poison the water system for your village. You'd have to go down to the dirty river for your water. So we're going to cap this well for you, turn it into a clean, closed pump system, and you'll be guaranteed clean, potable water. And so they do that, and they take their pictures to send the donors and to put in their calendars, and it would work great. But then 3 or 5 years down the line, the pump would break, and the organization usually hadn't put aside money or training for how that was going to be fixed down. And by this point, the village was on their own, without money to fix it, without training to fix it, and also with a lot of pressure to not simply bust it open and get back at the well, because a lot of the villages I worked in were afraid that you'd be labeled problem village and that no development organization would want to come and work with you anymore. So a lot of common sense things would sometimes be kept down because people were afraid to speak up in that regard. So that was another example of something that seemed really great but had some side effects that people weren't thinking about. The last sort of cautionary tale I bumped into that I want to talk to you about was actually a Peace Corps volunteer had done this, and that was the way houses worked there is you had like a bunch of different huts, one for sleeping, one for storing things, one for cooking. And the cooking hut was a miserable place I hated being in. I actually just built a fire pit outside so I wouldn't have to deal with it because it was just this really smoky, well, you can imagine it's a fire with no chimney in a small hut, just you're choking with smoke the whole time you're cooking. And this volunteer realized these houses are made of mud anyway. We can easily with a machete cut a chimney into there and pipe away that smoke outside of that house, and then we're not going to have what must be bad for lungs, bad for eyes, and started doing that in the village. And within a year realized that had sent the malaria rates skyrocketing because even though the smoke was basically being inhaled and really bad for people who were cooking all day, it was keeping the bugs away. And the malaria was ending up to be a much quicker and dangerous disease than the lung damage was. And so these were some examples I encountered of, and there were lots of projects I did myself where with my best intentions I realized that it wasn't matching up with the needs and that there was sort of when you worked on your own assumptions, there was basically the other side of good intentions started being revealed to me. I won't talk about them specifically because I want to move along, but working in the South Pacific, I also encountered issues where ideas that sounded great to me or to other people weren't working so well and were causing other issues in another culture. And then living and working in Serbia for several years, I started to encounter some similar things, especially as American in a country where we'd intervened in a war in a region that saw it from a very different side than we had been seeing it in our newspapers. And one thing that I'd often think about was my director in Peace Corps would always warn me, he'd say, Chris, if you're working on a project and you're realizing it's going to look really good in your resume in the United States, it's going to sound really good back home for jobs, then you've got to think twice because it's probably pretty useless for the village that you're in because it's just by definition so different. So all of this, I've been working overseas, starting to question, basically feeling uneasy with having some misgivings about my work in international development and about the other side of good intentions. And this is when I met Rochelle. I went back to school, went to graduate school in fine art. All along the times I've been doing this work, I'd also been kind of, I guess, on the side or on the sly, creating different forms of art along the way. So I decided to take 2 years, go back to art school, and kind of try to use art as a way to think through what was going on in some of my misgivings. And so I started out by building these things I called misguided machines. And essentially these misguided machines were machines that were built to fail at what they were designed to do. Or really they succeeded in what they were trying to do, but in that success just showed like how focused and how they were missing this much more important, larger context. So here's a 2-3 minute video of one of those machines. This is called, I Think She's Trying to Save the Fish. Yay! So obviously that was, I guess, sort of like a mechanical New Yorker cartoon. It was like a way of pointing at this scene I'd been a part of, but it felt exactly like that. I started feeling kind of crappy, like I'm standing on the side in my little white painted cave studio, making these things, pointing a finger at an industry or a field that I do believe in and that I know is full of very earnest people trying really hard to do really important work. And there was I on the side, just kind of pointing a finger at it and not doing anything about it. And I'm not even sure if I was speaking to them. They weren't going to strange art openings to watch dead fish be freed. And so I was trying to think of how I could kind of implicate myself in it more, make something that might actually have the potential for making a difference in that world that I was trying to talk about, while also working through these issues I was seeing. And I started thinking, okay, what I need to do is I need to become part of this misguided machine. Instead of building something that I kind of hide while it takes place, I need to figure out a way to make myself be part of the misguided machine. And so at the point I was also working with a lot of plywood, or I was in art school and trying different things and trying out plywood in different ways. And I came up with this misguided machine where I was a cog, and it was, I called this, I guess I won't tell the title yet. Basically I built a 14-foot tree out of plywood, and then planted it outside in the winter, and then chopped it down in the spring. And actually, Steve Robert is in the audience tonight. He's the guy in the red helping me chop it down. So chopped it down in the spring. I then brought it back into the wood shop, milled it back into a sheet of plywood, and returned it to Home Depot. And it took me 300 hours to do all this, so I'm not exactly sure who is the butt of this joke. But it taught me that I could make art that kind of began when the object ended, that I could start to create Frankenstein projects that ended up pushing me around and forcing me into situations, and that would just like kind of hop off the pedestal, crawl out of the gallery, and make me do things, and most importantly, started to intervene into the world directly around me. And that lesson was most important for me, this kind of loop that pushed me out. And so that's, for me, the direct next step to this Ghana think tank project was kind of this misguided machine where we're the cogs in the misguided machine and we're letting it push us around. And basically turning to art and how to deal with those, to negotiate the uneasy questions or equations I was dealing with in development. So originally, it's changed, but originally it was a punitive project. It was, I'm going to show my culture how it feels for someone else to tell us what to do, or to try to help us, but coming from an outsider perspective, and make us just deal with outsider solutions in our own lives. And we had think tanks initially in Ghana, Cuba, and El Salvador. We would collect problems in the United States, send them to think tanks in Ghana, Cuba, and El Salvador. That has since expanded to include a think tank in Iran, Afghanistan, Serbia, Mexico. It keeps growing. We actually have a group of incarcerated girls as well that's one of the think tanks, because we realized a lot of these class issues and first world, third world stereotypes we're dealing with could be found within our own nation as well. And these think tanks they come up with solutions which we implement. And our pledge is that if we can, we will implement that. Whether those solutions strike us as brilliant, improbable, difficult, unlikely, embarrassing, however we feel about it, we think the same way there's that pressure for that village in West Africa to implement solutions no matter what, we're going to try to do that no matter how it makes us feel. One way we collect problems are with anonymous postcards and also video. I'll show some of those video booths we've made. And the problems range from global to personal, from something like I'm afraid to dance at parties to homelessness or obesity. Sometimes they get incredibly personal, like this one was in Liverpool. I can't bring myself to believe in the power and beauty of me and trust that I am okay. Yesterday I pretended to be bisexual so that I would be accepted. So we range from that to questions like there's not enough diversity in my neighborhood. So they're not what you typically think a think tank would be thinking about. A couple examples. Probably the first problem that really tested us and whether we were willing to implement what we said, whether we liked it or not, It wasn't this one, but I'll talk about that next. We were working in Westport, Connecticut, which is a wealthy neighborhood, about a half hour of New York City. A lot of hedge fund operators live in Westport, Connecticut, and the Westport Arts Center had invited us to do the Ghana Think Tank project there. So we're going around Westport collecting problems, and we kept coming upon this problem of diversity. People were saying, you know, there's not enough diversity in our neighborhood. It's mostly wealthy and white people, and we'd love to have some diversity here. So we send these problems out to our think tanks, and El Salvador came back and said, you know, I bet there's diversity there. I bet you're just not counting certain people. If you look at whoever's fixing up your fancy lawns and fixing your house, I bet you they don't look like you, and you're just simply not counting them. So what you have to do is hire immigrant day laborers to attend your social functions, and that's going to help you realize that you already have diversity. And that was a very uncomfortable solution. I mean, it felt like objectifying people. It didn't jive with my personal ethics, but we said we would do it no matter what. So it was, you know, $15 an hour, Home Depot parking lot, just, you know, drink wine, eat sushi, practice your English, let other people practice Spanish, and that was a great like test of, okay, we were going through with this. So ranging from that to something super practical, like here was in Liverpool. The problem was this guy lived across the street from a kindergarten, and he said, every day I look out my window and there's cars parked on the sidewalk, and the police don't seem to care, and I see the parents with their strollers go off the sidewalk into the street where the cars are to go around these vehicles that are parked on the sidewalk. You need to help us solve this problem. So we sent it around, and Serbia came back, and they're like, what, this is not a problem. You dress as municipal workers, you build some parking blocks, done, they cannot park there. And so we did. And this is when I realized that with like a construction helmet and a high visibility suit, you can do almost anything. And so, yeah, there's that one. Here's another solution. This took place in Wales. The problem was the generation gap, that people seem to feel that the elderly are a drain on society. It was the problem. We sent that around, and the think tank in Iran came back and said, that's because young people think old people are boring and never did anything interesting, and we all know that a lot of people have a lot of interesting stories. So what you need to do is talk to old people, ask them to tell you their funny, dirty memories, and then put them on MP3 players for the youth to listen to. So then we had 3 Americans trawling around Wales, Cardiff, 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in the pub. You're usually going to find some retired people in there, and parks, markets, the same sort of thing. And we went around asking for people's funny, dirty memories, recorded them, and then in this installation in the gallery, we had this truism, and each headphone had a different funny, dirty story. Okay. So here's slightly different takes. Sometimes, I guess you can see so far a lot of the solutions seem to take this like larger societal issue and distill it down into an interpersonal interaction and kind of take something huge and make it more about the people involved. This summer it wasn't our purpose, but this is 2 summers ago in Queens, working with the Queens Museum. The projects this summer ended up starting to feel pretty activist in intention, or somewhat activism. This project was, we built this mobile video collection device, well, a trailer basically, that could record people's videos. I'll show that in a moment. And we would take it to different neighborhoods in Corona, Queens, and ask for people's problems. And we quickly realized there were 2 pretty distinct neighborhoods with different waves of immigrants. There was an older neighborhood that was populated with mostly older Italian immigrants who had come in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And then there were other parts of town which were mostly Ecuadorian, Colombian, Guatemalan, who had come more recently, the last 10 to 20 years. And when we were in the Italian part of town, we'd hear complaints about, like, my neighborhood is changing so much, I feel like I'm a minority in my own neighborhood. It doesn't feel like the immigrants today are assimilating like we did. What's happening to my neighborhood? Then we'd be in the other part and we hear, it feels like the old timers are racist to us newcomers, and we're seeing families broken up by deportation. And a lot of problems started to come along on that ilk. And so one of the solutions we got back was that we needed to set up focus groups of the people we met who are most anti-immigrant and ask them to design pro-immigrant advertisements to put on, well, they just said to make pro-immigrant advertisements. They said the problem with a lot of marketing is it's made by people who already believe in that point of view. And how is that ever supposed to speak to someone who doesn't? And so you need to seek out the people you're actually talking to and get them to craft the message. And so we started out with slogans written by current immigrants, and we paired them initially. We set up these focus groups of people who had spoken to us that we felt fit this category of anti-immigrant. And we would pair these pro-immigrant slogans with old Italian imagery, and basically ran it as if this is a focus group for an advertising agency and we need your help for what's most effective. And so they would go through and talk about what worked and didn't work, and then we did the exact same slogans but with Latino imagery. And then the conversation changed and we talked about what that was. And by the end of these sessions, we had a number of pro-immigrant slogans written by people who had expressed a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And so that's when the advertising, without a budget for advertising on the New York City buses, we basically, when those like injured, get a lawyer ads would come up, we'd wait till the bus stopped and then slap our pro-immigrant ads on the back of them. Here's another one that came out of that summer. This was this complaint that police were harassing people who looked like immigrants on the street using a loiter law. And as we started researching it, we realized that actually this loiter law had been deemed unconstitutional, and when the court was finding out about it, the NYPD, New York Police Department, was being fined $1,500 for contempt of court, and then up from there. So we started putting together these common sense. I looked up the official weight and what a sign has to look like to be somewhat legal in New York City, and we made all these aluminum signs that we started putting up in the areas where people had complained to us that they were told to move on when they had the right to be there. And it says we get two kinds of reactions. One for newer people of okay, I am allowed to be here, and for the most part, people thinking just what are you talking about? Everywhere's a legal waiting zone, and it ended up being a kind of undercover but pretty effective way of getting people from different sides to think about this. Okay, so how do we collect these problems? Well, we build these video booths to collect problems. This was in Germany. And when I say video booth, it's these crazy video booths. They're designed to collect the problems from people. You can see, I can't jump that high. But you can see that big red button. You push that button and then you can say your problem. Was ist dein Problem means what is your problem? And you can tell us, and then that goes to the think tanks, and these other video monitors show different think tanks deliberating the different problems they've gotten. You can watch, kind of get a portrait of your own city by seeing all the different problems that other people in your city have talked about. You can sign up to help with solutions, watch video of the different solutions being implemented, and often you can see the shovel in the back, kind of works as a workshop where we can meet up with people who are visiting the gallery who've signed up, who want to help us implement these different solutions. So it kind of, it's a sculpture, a video booth with a lot of different purposes. It also functions as a sculpture in a more traditional or modernist sense. And this is a way, this was in Wales. For people who don't consider this as art, I know my father-in-law, whenever I talk about this, he says, you want to know if that's art? I'll tell you if it's art. I can tell just by looking at it, and that ain't art. And so we don't want to just speak to people who think that this kind of weird things involving people and street signs and putting up bus ads is art. We want to make sure we're kind of using art to get to as large an audience as possible. So we'll often build these things to look like art, to look like some famous Sculpture 101 slide, so that someone who's like, oh, this is art, it's a big red thing, that's art, comes into it. Then maybe they'll see the video and realize what's going on, and it's kind of I call it a bait and switch when I'm feeling most cynical. This is part of that same one. Here's a video booth we built in China last winter. This was part of an before that. It was part of an architecture show, actually. And so each of those old tires, there's about 40 of them, had a different video on it, and each was a different face of a Chinese citizen stating their China problem. And then we sent those problems to think tanks we formed we added 2 for this one, of Tibetans and of people from Taiwan, as well as our usual Ghana, Mexico, and Serbia. There's another shot of it. That's the video booth where you could hit the button and leave your problem. Here's an example of one of the tires with the screen showing someone's issue. And this should look familiar. What we've started to do is sometimes we'll get repeat problems. So in Wales, we had the problem of the generation gap of elderly being seen as a drain. In China, we also got this issue of a generation gap. And so we're like, okay, we've gotten the solution, let's try that out here. And so this was the collecting funny, dirty memories. And so many of them involved Mao. It was a big surprise. And then we recorded them and put them here, same as before. Here's the legal waiting zone. Ended up working for there as well. Okay. So now I wanted to talk about recently in Tbilisi, Georgia. I mean, we've been doing it, 6 years now, and we've been trying to try out different things. And in Tbilisi, Georgia, our goal was, it generally takes like months, 3 to 6 months for this process to take place, to collect the problems and everything to happen. And it usually involves the collection, resolution, and display of community problems, pairing of unlikely people together, and symbolic sculptural elements. So basically, we wanted to condense these things that take forever into one moment in time. Can we make this happen in a half hour instead of 3 to 6 months? And so what we did was build something that looks like a modernist sculpture. This was sort of, I don't know if you'll get these references, but like Tobias Putri is an artist who works like this, meets Eames' House of Cards, and it's kind of got this Puritan stocks thing to it. So we built this sculpture, and the trick was that each hole was for a body part. And so to make this sculpture come to life, you had to stick your head or leg or arm, one body part through a hole in this sculpture, and then write your problem in Georgian on this. And then someone else would take their piece, insert it, and you're now connected, and you'd have to write your solution to their problem, and vice versa. And so you'd kind of like amass this the sculpture of unlikelies, of people and wood and problems and solutions. And I mean, we were really lucky, as you can see from this photo, in getting a really diverse crowd there. We did it at an art biennial, but we also brought it into this market where you could buy car parts. And so we started to get a really different kinds of people mixed together with this. Okay. And this project is an example of a much larger approach. When we started Ghana Think Tank, we realized that it couldn't work in a typical art cycle, gallery cycle, which is 3 to 6 months, that like it was not enough time. 1 second. Drink of water. So we created a sort of vague 10-year plan. And this vague 10-year plan was the first 5 years we're just going to exist in the art world and not think about any other ramifications and let this thing be what it is. But after that, we're going to also try to start folding back into some of the worlds that we feel like we're talking about or that we're coming from. And in this case, it was, can we use this Ghana Think Tank process outside of art, but in development? Like, can it actually play a useful role in the fields of development where we'd originally come to this from frustration? And so this started in Kosovo, in a town called Mitrovica, which is a town that's divided by a river. And to the north of this river, it's Serbs on up. And to the south of this river is Albanians down south. And it was part of Yugoslavia, and then when Yugoslavia started breaking up, this was the last part to go. Kosovo didn't declare independence until 2008. And it was a bitterly fought over ethnic war, genocide. It was, I guess, difficult situation is obviously an understatement. And this town here is probably the last remaining violent hotspot because of its geography, where there's one town where Kosovo in 2008 declared independence, said we are our own nation. They didn't do it officially with the UN, so as far as the UN's concerned, they haven't declared independence. But 70-odd countries have recognized them as a country. Serbia, however, says, no, Kosovo is part of Serbia still. You haven't done this legally. And so in Mitrovica, you have Serbian police patrolling with Serbian laws. You have Kosovo police patrolling with their laws. And then on the bridge, you have international troops with huge guns and these military vehicles guarding that bridge between the two neighborhoods. I mean, this gives a good indication of like how militarized day-to-day life is, where you have the one sign for trucks and then the speed limit sign for tanks. And another part of it was our role as Americans there. To the south of the river, which was largely Albanians, we were heroes. We'd given them their own country. We'd come in and bombed the Serbs in the late 90s and made it possible for them to declare independence. There's a huge 3-story portrait of Bill Clinton on a building, and another one of Hillary Clinton. And so to the south, we couldn't pay for anything. Americans were heroes. To the north, we were the people who, this upstart nation that existed much less time than Serbia had. They still reference this war in the 1300s as a precedent for what's going on now. And we had basically stolen the heart of their nation from them. They call Kosovo Kosovo i Metohija, which is literally the heart of our nation, and it's where a lot of the oldest monasteries are. And so while all this is going on, I don't know if you can see in the upper right-hand corner, see that silver bridge? That's actually this bridge. So what we noticed when we arrived there, was that just a couple hundred meters down from where all the news cameras are and where all the military vehicles are, was this little footbridge where people were crossing without having to pass a military checkpoint, where kids were playing in the water. And we realized that this is the sort of diplomatic spirit we could work with. This is where the real diplomacy was going on. And if young Albanian and Serb kids were playing in this river, maybe this is more the approach that we can actually make a difference with than up there on the bridge with the cameras and the guns. And so we tried to extend the Ghana think tank process to here. So if our premise is to ask unlikely people to solve your problems, to help us overcome stereotypes, then we should ask Serbs to solve problems of Albanians and vice versa. And so that's what we did. We printed up these cards that said, my Mitrovica problem is, in Serbian on one side and in Albanian on the other. And we kind of played the naive American of Serb, Albanian, whatever. This town's called Mitrovica, right? What's your Mitrovica problem? And so one day we'd go to pubs and cafes and offices in the south and give them these cards and get a bunch of problems. And then we'd translate those into Serbian and English and Albanian and cross to the other side of the river. And the next day, bring those to coffee shops and pubs and office buildings, asking, help us solve these Mitrovica problems. And we would usually take a photo of the person who gave us the problem, but obscure their face, because a lot of people involved wanted to be anonymous. Or we'd use a photo that we took in Mitrovica that fit in. And pretty soon on, people would catch on to what was going on and be like, oh, this is crap. This is not true. They don't know what they're talking about. This is just not proper. And then be like, yes, parking, such a pain. Water, we were surrounded by rivers, yet the municipality can't manage to get us water. What's wrong? And pretty soon we started getting this stack of problems that were shared. Here's a couple examples of problems. This one was about us, actually. That was interesting. Talking to people, they felt like if they could just implement capitalism right, then everybody would do fine. And they were just trying to figure out, we see all the money coming in, but it's not happening. What are we doing wrong? And after several days of this, we started to get the question of people we were working with a couple times of why are you here? It feels like we're talking to the other side. I'm not sure what you're doing in this picture. And so I said, well, do you mean you want to talk to them directly? And of course. Well, I don't understand why you need to be in this conversation. And so okay. So are you saying we should invite people who are giving these problems to come to this side? And yes, that's what I'm saying. So we went across the river and invited a group of Serbs to come work with this group of Albanians. And to our amazement, we hadn't intended this, hadn't expected this at all. They accepted. And so a group of people who hadn't crossed that bridge since the war ended in 1999 came across the bridge to work with each other on this. We realized that both sides were afraid of each other, but both sides really wanted to be with each other, to go back to Mitrovica being a town that didn't need a separate sign for how fast tanks should be driving. And so they formed a team to try to get other people to feel the same way, to get other Serbs and Albanians to start to meet each other. And they thought one way was to clean up the river. They said now the only people who play in the river are little kids, Roma, and we need to clean this up, make it a place where adults are going on a picnic and meet each other. And so they formed a group that started cleaning up both sides of the river. And I remember at one point we're on the north side of the river, and there's the guys with the guns on the bridge up there, and this big bad-looking guy with a pit bull walking by, shaved head, and we're cleaning up, and then there's this graffiti written on the side of the wall, on the wall of the river, the cement facing the Albanian side, that said, "Fuck Albania." And then the Albanian sees that, and he points to the other side where it says, "Fuck Serbia." And then they looked to each other like, "See, we do want the same thing." And people were laughing. So that was the beginning of that one. Another was they talked about that there's 60% unemployment here. People don't have much to do. The older people have great memories of bars, of mountains. You can see the mountains that's on the north side that they used to go to. We need to make a bus that will take people free wherever they want to go, as long as it's the other side of the river from where they are now. And so while the time we were there, created a bus that did that sort of thing, taking people to sites of importance to the other side. Let's see. And then they had some ideas that we could not implement and that I now am in the process of fundraising for so that we could do eventually. The one I'm most excited about is they said, look, no matter how much we clean up this river, in the end, it really is only like 1.5 feet deep in town. And we're not sure, like, once you're taller than 3 feet, how much you're willing to wade in this thing. What you need is a big swimming pool right in the middle of that river. If you can get Lady Gaga playing there, or at least her music, and some really hot Albanian and really hot Serbian lifeguards, then you've got it. All the kids are going to come down and meet each other. So that's I'm now in the strange place of trying to raise money to build a swimming pool and get Lady Gaga and hire a lot of hot lifeguards from both ethnicities in here. Okay. So moving on from there to the Muslim world. This was on the back of this kind of initial soft foray into diplomacy. We received an opportunity to work with the U.S. State Department in Morocco and to try to use a similar process. We actually initially were hired, I guess, commissioned to do this project in Lebanon, but then the fighting in Syria spilled over and they didn't want us going there, so we were pushed to Morocco at the last minute, transferred to Morocco, I should say, the last minute. We had a variety of problems. What we did was take U.S. problems we collected over the past 6 years and bring them to basically rural Moroccans to ask for help. And they range from like poverty and obesity to neighbors who don't know each other to someone said, live in a society in which it doesn't matter that I don't care about people. And similarly, we paired them with photos, had them in Arabic. Let's see. And then we built a solar-powered video booth in a donkey cart in Arabic, Berber, and French. And so we had this screen and this bright red button, and it says, please help us. And we would go around from village to village asking for help, African solutions to American problems. This was the donkey cart. That's Berber for come and talk, and on the other side was in Arabic, come and talk. And we've left it behind so they can keep working with it. It's basically a solar-powered video booth for people to meet and help solve American problems. And initially we encountered a lot of resistance. It wasn't that long after the YouTube riots when that video about Muhammad, the trailer came out and there were all those riots. And the first question I got was, is this some lame apology from the United States for that YouTube video? I'm like, well, no, we've been doing it for a couple of years now. It was before that. But when they saw we were earnestly implementing the solutions they came up with, they started coming around and getting really excited to see, like, oh, I said this, and now this guy did this in New York, and you're actually listening to us. And it was in a matter of weeks. It was pretty amazing how, this hostility turned into camaraderie simply from, I guess, fulfilling a promise or from, I guess, putting someone in the opposite situation. We weren't Americans coming in telling them what to do. We're Americans coming in and asking them for help. And it wasn't a joke. We were trying to do whatever you told us to do. And now I wanted to talk about the next project. This is the Creative Capital Grant that Rochelle had mentioned is the beginning of this project. And it's got a think tank at the Mexico border. And the idea is we'll build a portable video booth, either in a backpack or a briefcase. And the idea is to kind of coming from what was happening in Mitrovica with Albanians and Serbs, and also a bit of what was happening in Queens, where we were asking people who seemed anti-immigrant to help us create pro-immigrant slogans for advertising campaign. The idea is to work with, we'll see, this is a tough one. This is, I guess, the scariest one so far, but it's going to be a several-year project. The idea is to collect problems with this portable video booth from like the self-appointed militias guarding the border, and then to cross the border and ask from immigrants who are crossing the border for their solutions. And it'll obviously be a multi-step process to actually getting to that stage, starting out with organizations that are working for both sides of this. I mean, all we have at this point is like the programming and the technology for the solar paneled video booth, and some contacts and the beginning of a postcard. Because I realized my immigrant problem means something, we don't have to change the wording at all, and it takes a completely different meaning when we cross the border or talk to different people on either side of the border. Okay, so to finish, I have a 5-minute video about Ghana Think Tank that just kind of see a little bit of what happens. So here you go.
There's a lot of children that are a little overindulged, and adults that are overindulged.
Liverpool City Council is composed of corrupt suits.
I am getting old and I want to be young. I am getting fat and I want to be thin. I would like to have sex instead of dreaming about sex. Well,
how do you find your passion?
The kids driving around with that crazy boombox in their trunks or their cars.
My problem is that I'm never happy.
This is a problem, and this is a racial problem.
Una de las cosas que más admiro de Estados Unidos es la cultura.
Say if you're white or if you're black.
See, the Gombini, I will let you right from the beginning, and I may implement this kind of teachings to the kids. When I'm not going to come down, they can tell me. Only me, and the Bicumela, who have any jet, when she let me. Now make I'm a beer. No one Bicumela, who I'm sure I'm a German, couple of good, I'm a character speed. No, let my label. But I'm on a for me, and she's almost film.
Y ahí digo, porque ahí en Estados Unidos no sabes ni el nombre de tu vecino. Sales, me vale gorro. Hay casos que el vecino ya se murió y tú ni.
Както доведемо без спорт, неко затворено средину Добрање, речимо, и sad oni не могу тамо, нису добро дошли то. И šta да радимо да затворимо без спорт?
I question the question. Who is it that decides it is true or false idea?
Y quizás definir bien si tienen no sé cuántas millas de canchas de golf, pues que especifiquen una donde pueden hacerlo, y en sus casas que no usen pesticidas, que se dediquen a disfrutar, que crezcan. Si son flores, hasta les van a adornar el espacio de la grama. Para mí eso sería el consejo.
Otra cosa, y eso sí yo lo he visto con, por ejemplo, en los Estados Unidos con los afroamericanos, ellos sí respetan a sus viejos, ¿no? ¿Sí? O sea, a su abuela, eso sí lo respetan. Y los latinos lo hacen, los asiáticos lo hacen. Aquí en Westport el problema es que la mayoría son blancos, y los blancos son a los que va dirigido, yo creo que esto, ¿no?
The solution was very interesting to me, and it was the suggestion that we rename our dog Love.
¡pum!, nos suena en la ventana del vecino para que entienda que ya la mascota dejó de ser el problema y el problema ahora somos nosotros. O sea, yo creo que al final de cuentas, lo que siempre he dicho, la tolerancia.
Hey, that's it. Thanks. All right, thanks. So, questions? All right. Yep. Well, some of the solutions are sometimes much bigger than we could possibly ever do, like laws or whatever we could do. When we send out those problems, we say, try to keep it to something we can do for $100,000 or do it for some people. When we students don't, we're above that, we don't. Beyond that, we just try not to let our fear or embarrassment or just personal morality make the decision of what to do, and we try to implement what they tell us to do. Does that answer it? Okay. Other questions? Yep.
Where do you find people that work with Americans in Ghana, in Africa, in Ireland? How did they become involved in the program?
Okay, initially it was all our personal contacts. John Ewing had worked in Cuba and El Salvador. I had worked in Serbia and Benin and a lot of countries in the South Pacific, in Asia, and so, and Carmen grew up in Mexico and Texas, and Maka grew up in Ghana. So initially it was people we knew. The think tanks, just like our only rule is that we try to pick groups of people from think tanks who aren't artists and who aren't in international development. Because we know there's a time in the two worlds we're really uncomfortably straddling, just we're really doing them at all, and we want to make sure we're getting other voices. And beyond that, we just try to be random, but also isolated from the United States if possible, or from wherever the host country is. So for instance, in Ghana, our think tank is currently a group of bike mechanics. In Cuba, it's a 3-generation family. In El Salvador, it's a rural radio station. In Mexico, it's a group of teachers. Serbia, a group of lawyers. And so it's pretty random beyond that. Yep.
I was intrigued by your comment that you were trying to make a machine into reduce the machine in which you were a cause.
Yep.
And I'm so curious about how you see the boundaries of your project. Is the project, is the art object the interaction between the people? Is it your recording of the project to show to us or to other people? And does it matter where you set the boundaries of the project?
Well, I feel it's important in so much as respecting is not the right word, but definitely speaking to every audience along the way. I sometimes get aggravated when there's artists who do something that lasts for a moment in time, and then you go to an exhibition and you get kind of a blurry black and white photo that proves it. I remember reading an article that was talking about artists do something crazy and then document it as a way to prove that they did it. And I feel that every step has to be something for the audience. So that's why, even if their only experience is walking by and seeing this crazy thing with screens, that's something. It's an aesthetic experience, and that's, if their only experience was that they, the solution of going door to door to meet neighbors, and that's all they have, that's something in its own right. And whether or not, that's considered art as well, I know that large parts of the art world are willing to accept almost anything as art, so it feels like it becomes a moot question. But it is an important question for two reasons. One is, I guess, instead of thinking of is it art or not, I'll think is this interesting or not? Is this changing someone's perspective? But also knowing the fact that it's called art in certain circumstances can kind of be a freeing factor. People are willing to try something that they wouldn't otherwise simply call it art. But I also know at the same time it means they're in fantasy land to a bit, and sometimes we'll purposely not use the art word because I know that then they can kind of dislocate it from the rest of their life and say oh, well, I did that crazy thing with that person because it was art, and that's not my life, and that doesn't have to affect me. So there's definitely times when the fact that I consider it art or that it's funded by an art organization would actually ruin the whole project. Does that sort of answer what you're getting? Okay. Other questions? Yeah, back there, and then you. Absolutely, over time. Initially, I was very adamant that that this isn't a development project. That for me, the focus is kind of highlighting the gaps, and that by taking a part of someone else's life, someone else's culture, and colliding it with something that you've asked for help with in your own life, and inserting part of their culture into your day-to-day life, you're going to experience that cultural difference unavoidably in a way that isn't theoretical, but that is experiential. And that was the most important. It wasn't we're not really about solving problems. We're about taking cultural difference and taking stereotypes and turning all my stereotypes about what Iran is into the fact that this group of Iranians asked me to collect funny, dirty memories. Or in another case, everybody we saw on the street frowning, we was convinced to let us take a picture of them and make them an iron-on t-shirt of their smiling face, and had this big party of the most surly people in Cardiff together, wearing their smiling face in their shirt, drinking drinks as the sun went down. That was quite a roundabout way to get to it. But so I forgot where I was coming from that. So yes, so initially that was is that making long-term change? No. I mean, on that side, John Paul Lederach had talked about worked in peace building for his life, or most of his life, and talked about feeling that top down in his experience wasn't working as well as bottom up in terms of making real deep relationships between people who shouldn't be close to each other was the way to start it. So I do kind of believe in that bubble up, and it is over time that being an art gesture started not being enough. And yes, overcoming stereotypes was one tangible thing that was taking place, but it felt wow, I was actually seeing issues that I believe in. I grew up in New York City. I did not know the person who lived this far away from me and my little brother's room. All I knew was when we played basketball late at night, they'd bang on their, and however many years I lived there, and I didn't know, so I start to bump into issues that I really do want help with, and realize that these solutions are making a difference in a very small scale. And this is definitely, John Ewing is pushing this the most, but at that 5-year mark where we said, okay, being art isn't enough anymore. It's got to start folding back into these other fields. Now that's becoming a high priority, and we're starting to look for funding that can make these things go on longer. We're really glad when we can start to revisit problems over and over to build on them. And definitely with the Creative Capital Grant, a large part of it is just coaching and making sure it's a multi-year thing. So it's definitely becoming more and more important in trying to figure out how it can actually have a long-term impact and not be a gesture or an illustration. But it took time to get there. You had a question.
You sort of answered it.
Okay.
What impressed me about it, and you said is just how honest you are about challenging yourself and your thinking in the project, and so that it's not just trying to solve problems, just solve them.
Oh, did we solve these problems?
Yeah.
In some cases, yes. In other cases, absolutely not. I'm sure we've exacerbated some. I know in Westport, while obviously hiring immigrant day laborers to show up at social functions isn't solving the problem of diversity, but I would think that it does point out that, oh yeah, I can actually maybe have lunch with that person next time they're doing my lawn, and remember that there are people too. And so it is, a lot of the solutions that really work for me are the ones that just point out what's already in front of our faces, but we don't notice, and I know I guess we like the same way. When we live in Fiji, I did not notice the ocean right there after living there for 6 months. I just cursing at the person slow in front of me in traffic. You forget everything around you, and it's nice to have an external perspective remind you. And then some, like the dog named Love, I cannot believe that actually solved it. That was probably the first time I was like, wait, this can actually work? And not just be self-flagellation. And it was, her dog barked so much that there was a petition to have the dog put down. Donna said, well, give the dog a loving name, and then when you're yelling at it, at least you're being loving about it. And so she her dog was named Duke. She changed his name to Love. And got these little bone aluminum stamp steel, I don't know, name tags that said love on them. And when we came back to visit her 3 months later, she's like, you can't scream love at someone and like keep that much hatred in your heart that I have. And I'm just like, shut up. And she said, so like, I started liking him more, and I actually took him for walks, and he just wanted my attention this whole time. And so that was a case where Tiny wanted seemed crazy to me. What is this going to do? We said we do, we did it, and actually solved in a small way. Yeah, and definitely that thing in Queens with the anti-immigrant, like that, it was an amazing experience of coming through. Of just, yeah. So some cases, yes, some cases not at all. Other points, just highlighting something in front of you. Other questions? Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
On behalf of the faculty, administration, and students here at the Institute of Politics, we'd just like to thank you for coming out and talking. It was very interesting, and thanks for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
This is a gift
Thanks.
for you.
All right. Thank you. And if you want to get involved, GhanaThinkTank.org. We're always needing help for implementing. Thank you. Actually, what am I doing?